The pulsating beats of Afrobeat music reverberated through the air, shaking the walls of the dimly lit club. A kaleidoscope of lights danced across the room, bouncing off the faces of the jubilant crowd. Laughter, music, and clinking glasses created a symphony of pure, unfiltered nightlife. In the VIP section, a group of young men occupied a corner, their table laden with expensive bottles of champagne and small chops. At the center of the group was Adewale, a Nigerian soldier recently promoted to the rank of captain. He was in his late 20s, tall, with a sturdy build that spoke of years of rigorous military training. Despite the humility of his background, Adewale carried himself with a quiet confidence that made him stand out. "Bro, tonight is on you," Tunde, his closest friend and fellow soldier, teased, raising his glass. "Promotion no be beans." "Ah, Tunde," Adewale laughed, leaning back in his chair. "I said he'll handle the drinks. Don't go and bankrupt me with your long throat." The table erupted in laughter, and another friend, Jide, leaned forward, grinning mischievously. "Whale, we need to toast to you properly. Not every day we celebrate a street boy who turned into a captain. Omo, you deserve this." Adewale raised his glass, the smile on his face tinged with gratitude. "To hard work and grace," he said, his voice steady. They all clinked glasses, the champagne bubbling over as they laughed and drank. Just as Adewale was about to set his glass down, the atmosphere around him shifted. From the shadows of the crowded dance floor, she appeared. She wore a stunning red dress that glittered under the strobe lights, clinging to her figure like it was made just for her. Her dark skin shimmered with a golden hue, and her full crimson-painted lips curled into a playful smile. Every step she took toward their table felt deliberate, as though she was walking to a rhythm only she could hear. Tunde nudged Adewale. "Omo, see as this babe day comes straight for you. Weddin' you chop we no?" Adewale barely had time to process before she stopped right in front of him. She leaned down, her jasmine-scented perfume invading his senses, and without asking, lowered herself onto his lap. "Hello, soldier," she said, her voice smooth like honey. The table went quiet for a moment, before Jide let out a loud, exaggerated whistle. "Ah, whale! Your village people have decided to bless you tonight." Adewale chuckled nervously, unsure how to react. "Good evening," he said, trying to steady his voice. "You seem comfortable." "Why shouldn't I be?" she replied, tilting her head. Her dark eyes locked with his, and she traced a finger along the rim of his glass. "You look like a man who can handle a little weight." The entire table burst into laughter, and even Adewale couldn't help but join in. "I see you don't believe in asking for permission. Permission is overrated," she said nonchalantly. "Besides, you looked lonely." "Lonely key?" Tunde interjected, grinning from ear to ear. "This guy has us. How can he be lonely?" She ignored Tunde, focusing entirely on Adewale. "What's your name, soldier?" she asked. "Adewale," he replied. "And you?" She smiled, leaning closer until her lips were inches from his ear. "Call me Lola." Lola's voice was sultry, her presence magnetic. The way she sat on his lap, as though she owned him, drew curious glances from nearby tables. Adewale felt his friend's amused stares, but couldn't bring himself to ask her to leave. "Are you always this bold, or is it the champagne talking?" he asked, his tone teasing. "Boldness is my second name," Lola replied, picking up his glass and taking a sip without asking. "Besides, you don't seem like the type of man to shy away from a challenge." Tunde slapped the table, laughing. "Whale, nah your type dem dey warn us about in soldier stories. See as the babe don pin you like handcuff. You guys should behave," Adewale said, shaking his head. Turning back to Lola, he asked, "So what brings you here tonight?" "Celebrating life," she said simply, leaning back against him. "And you?" "My promotion," Adewale replied. "It's been a long journey." "Promotion?" "Impressive," she said, her eyes lighting up. "What rank?" "Captain," he said. "Captain Adewale?" she repeated, her voice playful. "I like the sound of that." Jide leaned forward, his grin widening. "Lola, abeg, leave this guy small." "He's too quiet for you." Lola turned to Jide, raising an eyebrow. "And who said I like my men loud?" The group roared with laughter, and even Adewale couldn't help but smile. There was something about Lola that was disarming, her confidence both intimidating and intriguing. As the night went on, the conversation flowed easily. Lola seemed to fit right in, bantering with his friends while still keeping her attention on Adewale. At one point, she turned to him and asked, "Do you come here often?" "Not really," he admitted. "My friends dragged me out tonight. Clubs aren't really my scene." She smirked. You don't strike me as the clubbing type. Too disciplined, maybe? Something like that, he said. And you? Do you make it a habit to sit on strangers' laps? Only when the stranger looks as interesting as you, she replied, winking. The night passed in a blur of laughter, music, and champagne. By the time the club began to empty, Adewale felt like had known Lola for years. As she finally stood to leave, she leaned down, her lips brushing his ear. "Good night, Captain Adewale," she whispered. "I hope this isn't the last time we meet." Before he could respond, she was gone, disappearing into the crowd like a mirage. Tunde shook his head, patting Adewale on the shoulder. "Omo, you need to teach us this, your quiet boy charm. That babe na hot cake." Adewale smiled faintly, his mind still replaying the night's events. Lola had been a storm, unpredictable and unforgettable, and he had a feeling this was just the beginning. The first time Adewale saw her again, it felt like déjà vu. He was in uniform, standing at the barracks' main gate, giving instructions to a new recruit when she walked past. The sunlight glinted off her dark skin, and her unmistakable red handbag swung gently at her side. She was wearing a simple white blouse tucked into high-waisted jeans, and her braided hair was tied into a ponytail. "Lola?" Adewale blurted out before he could stop himself. She paused mid-stride and turned, her eyes narrowing in recognition before her lips curved into a smile. "Captain Adewale," she said, tilting her head. "Fancy meeting you here. Are you following me, or is this just a strange coincidence?" he teased, his voice betraying his surprise. She laughed softly, the sound as light as the breeze. "I could ask you the same thing. Do you work here?" "Yes, this is my station," he replied. "What about you? What are you doing here?" "Visiting a cousin," she said. "She lives just outside the barracks." A recruit interrupted their conversation to confirm instructions with Adewale, and by the time he turned back, Lola was already walking away, her red handbag bobbing behind her. "Wait," he called out. She turned, raising an eyebrow. "Let me walk you out," he offered. She smirked. "Trying to stretch your duties, Captain?" Adewale chuckled but said nothing, falling into step beside her as they walked to the main gate. They exchanged small talk about the weather and her cousin's stubborn toddler, and before she left, she turned to him with a mischievous smile. "Maybe fate's trying to tell us something, Captain," she said. "Maybe it is," he replied, his eyes holding hers. The second time he saw her, it was in a bustling shopping mall on the mainland. Adewale was pushing a cart through the aisles, grabbing supplies for a soldiers' community event, when he heard a familiar voice. "No, I need the large pack of cotton wool. Not this small one. Do you people want me to keep running back here every week?" He turned to see her standing at the counter of a pharmacy inside the mall, her hands on her hips as she argued with the pharmacist. She looked striking even in her casual outfit, a light blue dress and white sneakers. "Lola," he called out, pushing his cart toward her. She turned, her face breaking into a surprised smile. "Captain Adewale," she said, feigning exasperation. "You again? Are you stalking me?" "Maybe it's the other way around," he countered, grinning. "Don't flatter yourself," she said, though her eyes sparkled with amusement. "Shopping for the hospital?" he asked, nodding toward the items on the counter. "Yes," she replied. "We're always running out of supplies, and I hate waiting for the admin staff to get their act together." "Efficient and beautiful," Adewale said, shaking his head. "You're a rare combination, Lola," she raised an eyebrow. "Is that your soldierly charm talking?" "Maybe," he said, smiling. "Do you need help carrying your things?" "I think ill-managed," she replied, grabbing her bag. But as she walked past him, she paused and looked back. "Are you always this helpful, or do I bring out the best in you?" Adewale chuckled. "You'll have to stick around to find out." The third time he saw her, it wasn't a chance meeting. He was visiting Tunde at the military hospital after his friend had twisted his ankle during training. As Adewale sat by the bed, teasing Tunde about his clumsiness, the door opened, and in walked Lola, clipboard in hand. "Adewale?" she said, stopping short when she saw him. "Lola," he echoed, equally surprised. Tunde, lying on the bed, looked from one to the other and grinned. "Ah, so you two know each other?" "Yes," Lola said smoothly, walking over to check Tunde's chart. "Captain Adewale and I have crossed paths a few times." "That's an understatement," Adewale muttered, earning a sharp glance from Lola. After checking Tunde's vitals, Lola turned to Adewale. "So you're here playing nurse today?" "Something like that," he replied. "Didn't know you worked here. Now you do, she said, scribbling something on her clipboard. And I assume you'll be a regular visitor, considering how clumsy your friend here seems to be. Clumsy, Key? Tunde protested. Abeg, don't insult me in front of this beautiful nurse. Lola laughed, her smile lighting up the room. Well, Captain, if you're serious about helping, you can bring your friend some lunch. He's been complaining about hospital food all day. Yes, ma'am, Adewale said, giving a mock salute. As she left the room, Tunde turned to Adewale with a sly grin. Bro, if you don't marry that woman, I swear I will. Shut up, Tunde, Adewale said, though his own smile betrayed him. Over the next few weeks, Adewale found himself seeking out reasons to visit the hospital. Whether it was checking on a sick soldier or delivering supplies, he always hoped to run into Lola. And she seemed just as surprised and amused by their frequent encounters. One afternoon, as they stood by the hospital entrance after her shift, Adewale finally gathered the courage to ask, Lola, do you believe in fate? She glanced at him, her lips curving into a smile. Why do you ask? Because, he said, taking a step closer, I can't shake the feeling that I'm supposed to know you better. Her expression softened, and for a moment the usual teasing sparkle in her eyes was replaced with something deeper. Maybe you're right, she said quietly. So, he said, his voice steady, how about dinner? No uniforms, no coincidences, just you and me. Lola hesitated for a moment before nodding. All right, Captain, but don't think I'm an easy catch. I wouldn't dare, he said, smiling. As they walked out of the hospital together, Adewale couldn't help but feel that their story was only just beginning. Adewale paced his modest living room, glancing nervously at the clock on the wall. It was almost 7 p.m., and Lola would be arriving any moment. He tugged at the collar of his crisp white shirt, feeling the weight of the evening pressing on him. This wasn't just a dinner, it was a declaration of intent. Had spent the entire day preparing, enlisting the help of his fellow soldiers to transform his space into something out of a romantic movie. A small dining table was set in the center of the room, draped in a white linen cloth and adorned with a centerpiece of fresh roses. A string of fairy lights cast a warm, golden glow over the room, complementing the flickering candles on the table. The aroma of jollof rice, grilled prawns, and fried plantains filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of vanilla from a candle on the shelf. The wine was chilling in a bucket of ice, and soft jazz music played in the background, creating an intimate atmosphere. As Adewale adjusted the napkins on the table for the 5th time, a knock at the door jolted him out of his thoughts. He took a deep breath, smoothed down his shirt, and opened the door. Lola stood there, a vision in a sleek black dress that hugged her curves. Her hair was styled in loose waves, and her makeup was subtle but radiant. In her hand, she held a small bouquet of lilies. You look stunning, Adewale said, his voice soft. Thank you, she replied, her eyes sweeping over him. You clean up well, Captain, he chuckled, stepping aside to let her in. As she entered, her eyes widened at the sight of the transformed room. Wow, she whispered, taking it all in. This is beautiful. Did you do all this? Well, I had some help, he admitted, scratching the back of his neck. But yes, most of it was me. Lola turned to him, her expression a mix of surprise and admiration. You've outdone yourself. Only the best for you, he said, pulling out her chair. As she sat down, she noticed the little details, the handwritten menu card at her place setting, the carefully folded napkin shaped like a rose, and the small dish of chocolates waiting beside her plate. Is this a date or a presidential banquet? She teased, though her voice was filled with awe. Let's just say I wanted to impress, Adewale replied, taking his seat across from her. The meal was served course by course, with Adewale personally plating each dish. They laughed and talked as they ate, sharing stories about their childhoods, their dreams, and their favorite foods. You're full of surprises, Captain, Lola said, sipping her wine. I didn't expect you to be such a good cook. Military life teaches you many things, he said, grinning. Cooking happens to be one of them. As the night went on, the conversation grew more personal. Lola opened up about her journey into nursing, the challenges she faced, and her dreams of opening her own clinic someday. Adewale listened intently, his admiration for her growing with every word. You're incredible, he said softly. Strong, ambitious, and kind. I'm lucky to even know you. Lola's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at her plate. You're not so bad yourself, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. After dessert, A perfectly chilled bowl of fruit salad served with a dollop of whipped cream, Adewale stood and extended his hand. "Dance with me?" he asked. Lola hesitated for a moment before taking his hand. He led her to the center of the room, where the music had shifted to a soft, romantic tune. They swayed together, her head resting lightly on his shoulder, his hand warm against her back. For a while they didn't speak, letting the music and the moment speak for them. When the song ended, Lola pulled back slightly to look up at him. "This has been the most beautiful night," she said, her eyes shimmering. "It's just the beginning," Adewale replied, his voice steady. Lola smiled, and in that moment, with the candles flickering and the world outside forgotten, it felt like the start of something extraordinary. The barracks buzzed with activity as soldiers moved about, their faces tense with anticipation. Trucks loaded with supplies rolled in and out, their rumbling engines a backdrop to the chaotic scene. The looming threat of civil war had transformed the once calm military base into a hive of preparation. Captain Adewale stood in the strategy room, poring over a large map of Nigeria spread across the table. Red and blue pins marked key locations, representing federal and rebel forces. Around him were his superior officers and a few other captains, their faces grim as they discussed the next steps. "This is no longer just a threat," Major General Okoye said, slamming his hand on the table. "The secessionists are mobilizing, and intelligence confirms their intent to establish Biafra as an independent state. Gentlemen, we're heading to war." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the statement settling over them. Colonel Musa, known for his bluntness, broke the silence. "We must act decisively. If we don't crush this rebellion swiftly, it will embolden other regions to follow suit." Adewale cleared his throat, drawing attention. "Sir, with all due respect, this isn't just about crushing a rebellion. The people in the eastern region feel marginalized. Their grievances can't be ignored." General Okoye narrowed his eyes. "Are you sympathizing with the enemy, Captain?" "Not at all, sir," Adewale replied firmly. "I'm just saying that understanding their motivations could help us strategize better." The general nodded slowly. "Fair point. But our job is to protect the unity of this country, not to debate politics." "Captain Adewale, you've been tasked with overseeing troop readiness. How are the preparations coming along?" Adewale straightened. "Sir, we've been conducting intensive training drills. Morale is high, but we still need more supplies, particularly ammunition and medical kits. Also, some of the younger recruits need additional conditioning." "Noted," the general said. "What about intelligence gathering?" Lieutenant Colonel Hassan chimed in. "We've deployed spies to key locations in the east. They're feeding us information about the rebels' movements and supply lines. Captain Adewale has also been instrumental in identifying potential weaknesses in their strategy." The general turned back to Adewale. "Good work, Captain, but we need more than just weaknesses. I want a comprehensive plan for our first offensive by tomorrow morning." "Understood?" "Yes, sir," Adewale replied. Later that evening, Adewale sat in his office, scribbling notes on a notepad. The room was dimly lit, the only sound the scratch of his pen and the occasional chirp of crickets outside. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. The door opened and Lieutenant Tunde stepped in, a somber expression on his face. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Adewale said, gesturing for him to sit. "I might as well have," Tunde replied, sinking into a chair. "Right, there is talk among the troops. They're scared, Whale. Some of them have families in the east. They don't want to fight against their own people." Adewale sighed, rubbing his temples. "I understand their fear, Tunde, but we have a duty to this country. Unity comes at a cost." Tunde leaned forward. "And what about you? How are you handling all this?" Adewale paused, his pen hovering over the paper. "Honestly, it's not easy. I keep thinking about Lola, about what this war could mean for her, for us." Tunde raised an eyebrow. "You've got it bad, my friend, but she's strong. She'll understand." Adewale nodded, though his thoughts remained troubled. The next day, Adewale joined a group of officers for a secret briefing in an underground bunker. The air was thick with tension as they reviewed classified documents and maps. Colonel Musa pointed to a red pin on the map. "This is Enugu, the heart of Biafra's operations. If we can take control of this city, we'll cripple their command structure." Adewale frowned. "That's easier said than done, Colonel. Enugu is heavily fortified. A direct assault would result in massive casualties." What do you suggest, Captain? General Okoye asked. We could target their supply lines instead, Adewale said. Cut off their resources and weaken their defenses. It'll take longer, but it's a safer approach. The general considered this for a moment before nodding. All right, draft a detailed plan and present it at the next briefing. As the meeting continued, Adewale couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking a tight rope. The stakes were higher than ever, and one wrong move could plunge the nation into deeper chaos. That night, as he prepared for bed, Adewale received a call from Lola. I heard about the preparations, she said, her voice tinged with worry. How did you find out? He asked. Well, I work in a hospital. People talk, she replied. Are you okay? I'm managing, he said. But it's hard, Lola. This war. It's going to change everything. Promise me you'll be careful, she said softly. I promise, he said, his voice firm. But I need you to promise me something too. What's that? Don't lose hope, he said. No matter what happens, we'll get through this. There was a pause on the line before she replied, I promise. As Adewale hung up, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for his country, he was fighting for the future he wanted to build with Lola, and he wouldn't let anything stand in his way. The sunlight poured through the wide windows of Adewale's modest house, illuminating the freshly painted walls and the carefully arranged furniture. Lola stood in the center of the living room, her hands on her hips, surveying her new home with a mix of excitement and nervousness. This is it, Adewale said, stepping behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. What do you think? It's cozy, she said with a soft laugh, turning to look at him. I love it, Whale. It feels like home already. Adewale smiled, his eyes warm. That's because you're here. You're what makes this place feel alive. Lola blushed, pulling away gently. Flattery will get you nowhere, Captain. Oh, it's not flattery, nurse. It's the truth, he teased, grabbing a box from the stack near the door. Now, where do you want this? She glanced at the box labeled Kitchen Essentials and pointed toward the small kitchen. That goes in there. And be careful, my favorite mugs are in there. Yes, ma'am, Adewale said with a mock salute, making her laugh. By afternoon, the house was buzzing with activity. Adewale's friends, including Lieutenant Tunde and Sergeant Ojo, had come over to help. Well, you never told me Lola was this organized, Tunde said, unpacking a box of books. Everything has a label. Even the labels have labels. Lola rolled her eyes as she passed by with a stack of folded towels. Someone has to keep things in order around here. Left to you men, this place would look like a war zone. She's not wrong, Ojo said, grinning. Remember Whale's old place? I'm still traumatized by that sock I found under the bed. Adewale laughed, throwing a pillow at him. Hey, it wasn't that bad. It was worse, Tunde quipped, dodging the pillow. As the friends joked and worked, Lola found herself smiling more than she had in weeks. The camaraderie between the men was infectious, and she felt herself becoming part of their little family. By evening, the house was finally in order. The furniture was arranged, the boxes were unpacked, and the place looked more like a home. Adewale insisted on cooking dinner to celebrate, much to Lola's amusement. You? Cook? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Don't underestimate me, he said, tying an apron around his waist. I've been feeding myself for years, you know. Barely, Tunde muttered under his breath, earning a glare from Adewale. In the kitchen, Adewale busied himself preparing a simple but hearty meal of fried rice and grilled chicken. Lola joined him, chopping vegetables and stealing glances at him as he worked. You're really trying to impress me, aren't you? She said, her voice teasing. Always, he replied without missing a beat. Their playful banter continued as they cooked, filling the house with laughter. By the time dinner was ready, the table was set with a bouquet of fresh flowers in the center, a small touch from Lola that made all the difference. As they ate, the conversation turned to their plans for the future. So how does it feel to be living with a soldier? Tunde asked Lola, a mischievous glint in his eye. It feels secure, she said, glancing at Adewale. I know hell always have my back. And your heart, Ojo teased, earning a playful shove from Adewale. Enough, you clowns, Adewale said, shaking his head. Let's just eat. Later that night, after their friends had left and the house was quiet, Lola and Adewale sat on the couch, a blanket draped over their legs. Today was fun, Lola said, resting her head on his shoulder. It was, Adewale agreed, his arm around her. Thank you for making this house feel like a home. Thank you for letting me in, she said softly. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the glow of the table lamp casting a warm light over them. "I promise to take care of you, Lola," Adewale said suddenly, his voice serious. "No matter what happens, you'll always have a place here, with me." Lola looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "And I promise to stand by you, Whale, through everything." In that moment, surrounded by the quiet comfort of their shared space, they felt a deep sense of peace. They were building something together, something strong, something lasting. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, they knew they would face them as a team. The early morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow on the bedroom. Lola stirred awake to the sound of birds chirping outside. She turned to her side, smiling as she watched Adewale, still asleep, his face relaxed and peaceful. She leaned over to plant a soft kiss on his cheek before slipping out of bed. Lola had become a vital part of Adewale's life. She wasn't just his partner, she was his confidant, his anchor. From helping him unwind after long days at the barracks to ensuring their home was a sanctuary, she had seamlessly integrated herself into his world. She headed to the kitchen, her movements graceful as she prepared breakfast. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the house, mingling with the scent of frying eggs and toasted bread. She set the table with care, humming softly to herself. "Something smells amazing," Adewale's voice came from behind her. She turned, grinning. "Good morning, sleepyhead." He walked over, pulling her into a warm embrace. "You're spoiling me, you know that?" "That's the plan," she replied, laughing as she playfully swatted his arm. As they sat down to eat, Adewale's phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up, his expression changing as he read the message. "What is it?" Lola asked, her tone concerned. "Just a reminder about today's briefing," he said, tucking the phone into his pocket. After breakfast, Adewale moved to his study to gather his things for the day. Lola followed him, leaning against the doorframe as he shuffled through papers on his desk. "You always look so serious when you're working," she teased. He chuckled, glancing at her. "That's because work is serious, my love." Her eyes landed on a small brown book on the edge of his desk. Its worn leather cover looked out of place among the neatly arranged documents. "What's that?" she asked curiously. Adewale stiffened slightly before picking up the book and slipping it into his bag. "Just some notes," he said casually. Nothing important. We're so new." Lola raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. She trusted him, after all. Later that morning, as Adewale prepared to leave for the barracks, he kissed Lola goodbye and headed out the door. She waved at him, watching until his car disappeared down the street. She spent the morning tidying up the house, her thoughts drifting to Adewale and the life they were building together. She felt content, happy to be part of his world. But that peace was shattered when Adewale called her around noon. Lola, his voice was tense, almost frantic. "What's wrong?" she asked, immediately on edge. "Have you seen my brown book, the one I left on my desk this morning?" Lola frowned, trying to recall. "You put it in your bag, didn't you?" "I thought I did," he said, his voice strained. "But it's not there. I've checked everywhere." She felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "I haven't seen it since this morning. Maybe you left it in the car?" "I've already checked," he said, frustration evident. "Lola, that book it's critical if it's fallen into the wrong hands." Her heart sank. "What do you mean? What was in it?" "Strategic plans," he admitted, his voice low. "Locations, movements, everything. It's classified information, Lola." "Oh, Whale," she whispered, fear creeping into her voice. "I need you to check the house," he said urgently. "Every corner, every drawer. It has to be there." Lola searched the house frantically, turning over cushions, opening drawers, and even checking under the bed. But the book was nowhere to be found. When Adewale returned home, his face was a mask of worry. He joined her in the search, going through every inch of the house again. "It's not here," he said finally, his shoulders slumping. "What do we do now?" Lola asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to report this," he said, his tone grim. "But before I do, I need to be sure it's truly lost." The rest of the day was a blur of tension and unease. Adewale retraced his steps, visiting the barracks and speaking with his subordinates, but no one had seen the book. By nightfall, he was sitting in the living room, his head in his hands. Lola sat beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. Well, figure this out," she said softly. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and despair. "I hope so, Lola, because if we don't, the consequences could be catastrophic. As the night stretched on, the missing book became a shadow over their once peaceful home, a reminder of the high stakes of Adewale's work and the fragile balance of their lives together. The warm afternoon sun bathed the small garden in a golden glow. The scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the faint aroma of hibiscus flowers that dotted the edges of the lawn. Lola had prepared a simple picnic: sandwiches, fruit, and a flask of chilled zobo. A woven mat spread out beneath the shade of a large mango tree completed the idyllic setting. "Isn't this nice?" Lola asked, tilting her head back to feel the breeze. Adewale lay beside her on the mat, his arms behind his head and his face relaxed. "It's perfect," he said, his voice soft. "I wish every day could be like this." She laughed, swatting at him playfully. "You're the one always running off to save the world, Captain." "Guilty," he replied with a grin, sitting up to pour them both a glass of zobo. They chatted about everything and nothing, about their plans for the garden, a potential trip to Abeokuta, and Lola's latest antics at the hospital. The laughter between them was easy, their connection undeniable. "I could get used to this," Adewale said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "Used to what?" Lola asked, raising an eyebrow. "Us. Moments like this." He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. "You make everything better, Lola." Her cheeks flushed, and she looked away, pretending to focus on peeling an orange. "You're too good with words, you know that?" "Only when it comes to you," he replied, his gaze unwavering. Their peaceful afternoon was interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching the garden gate. A uniformed soldier, his face stern, stood at the entrance. "Captain Adewale?" the man called out. Adewale rose to his feet, his demeanor shifting instantly to that of a soldier. "Yes?" The soldier handed him a sealed envelope, saluted, and left without a word. "What is it?" Lola asked, her heart sinking as she watched Adewale's face darken while he read the letter. He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket, his jaw tight. "It's time," he said simply. "Time for what?" Her voice wavered. "The war, Lola. It's started. I need to report to the barracks immediately." Her heart stopped for a moment before pounding painfully in her chest. "Well, no." He crouched beside her, taking her hands in his. "Lola, this is my duty. You knew this day might come." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I know, but I thought we had more time. I thought," her voice broke. "I thought so too," he admitted, his voice gentle but firm. "But I have to go. My men are counting on me. The country is counting on me." She threw her arms around him, clinging to him as if that could keep him from leaving. "Promise me you'll come back," she whispered, her tears soaking his shoulder. "I promise," he said, holding her tightly. "I'll come back to you, Lola, no matter what." Inside the house, Adewale moved quickly, gathering his gear and packing a small duffel bag. Lola followed him silently, her heart heavy. She handed him items he forgot and adjusted his uniform with trembling hands. "Don't forget this," she said, pressing a small framed photo of them into his bag. He looked at her, his eyes soft. "Thank you." As they stood by the door, he cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "You're the strongest woman I know," he said, "and I need you to be strong for me now." She nodded, though her heart felt like it was breaking. "I'll try." He kissed her forehead, lingering for a moment. "I love you, Lola." "I love you too, Aided," she said, her voice trembling. At the gate, a military jeep waited for him. The sound of its engine was a harsh reminder that this was real. Adewale climbed in, his gaze never leaving Lola as the vehicle pulled away. She stood at the gate, her arms wrapped around herself, watching until he was out of sight. When she could no longer see him, she turned back to the house, her steps heavy. The garden, once a haven of joy, now felt unbearably quiet. She sank onto the mat, clutching the empty flask of zobo, and let the tears flow freely. "Please, God," she whispered into the silence, her voice broken. "Bring him back to me." The journey to the assigned post in the nearby village was supposed to be uneventful. Adewale sat in the lead truck of the convoy, the rhythmic hum of the engine blending with the occasional chatter of his men. The dirt road stretched ahead, lined with thick bushes and towering trees that swayed in the light breeze. "Stay alert," Adewale said, his voice steady but firm. "This area has reported movements from the Biafran troops." "Yes, sir," his second-in-command, Sergeant Danjuma, replied, scanning the terrain with sharp eyes. Despite the tension in the air, Adewale felt a sense of pride in his men. They were well-trained and disciplined, ready to execute their mission. The orders were clear: secure the village, establish a defensive position, and ensure the safety of the locals. But as the convoy moved deeper into the forested area, the atmosphere grew heavier. "Sir," Danjuma said suddenly, "something doesn't feel right." Before Adewale could respond, the loud crack of gunfire shattered the stillness. "Ambush!" he shouted. The truck screeched to a halt as men scrambled for cover. Bullets rained down from all directions, their origin concealed by the dense foliage. Adewale quickly assessed the situation, barking orders to his men. "Return fire! Secure the perimeter!" The chaos was deafening. Explosions rocked the ground as grenades were thrown, and the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Despite their best efforts, it became clear they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. "Fall back!" Adewale yelled, signaling his men to retreat. But as they attempted to regroup, a sudden wave of heavily armed Biafran soldiers emerged from the bushes, surrounding them. "Drop your weapons," one of them commanded, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Adewale and his men had no choice. Reluctantly, they laid down their arms, their faces a mix of anger and frustration. The captured soldiers were blindfolded and led through the forest. Adewale's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the ambush. Someone had to have leaked their route. Their plans had been confidential. Hours later, they arrived at what seemed to be a makeshift camp. The blindfolds were removed, and Adewale blinked against the harsh sunlight. His jaw clenched as he took in the sight of the Biafran flag fluttering in the breeze. He was led into a large tent, his hands bound behind his back. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, filled with the murmurs of Biafran officers strategizing. But it wasn't the room that sent a chill down his spine. It was the figure seated at the head of the table. "Lola?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. She turned, her red beret and neatly pressed uniform a stark contrast to the woman he had kissed goodbye just days ago. Her expression was cold, calculating, and utterly unfamiliar. "Adewale," she said, her tone devoid of emotion. The world seemed to tilt as he tried to process what he was seeing. What is this?" She stood, her movements precise and commanding. "This, my dear husband, is the reality you've been blind to." He shook his head, disbelief etched into every line of his face. "You're with them? How? Why?" Lola's eyes narrowed. "Do you think I didn't have my reasons? Do you think I could just sit back and watch while you fought for a government that oppressed my people?" "I fought for peace," he shouted, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and heartbreak. "Peace?" she scoffed, crossing her arms. "Is that what you call the massacres? The starvation? The lies?" His mind flashed back to moments they had shared, the laughter, the quiet nights, the promises of a future together. "All this time, you were using me," he said, his voice hollow. "I didn't plan for this to happen," she admitted, her tone softer for a moment. "But when I saw an opportunity to gather intelligence, I took it." Adewale felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under him. "You betrayed me, Lola. You betrayed everything we stood for." "I did what I had to do for my people," she said, her gaze unwavering. "And now, Adewale, you have a choice to make. You can join us, or you can face the consequences." His heart ached as he looked at her, the woman he had loved and trusted. "I could never betray my men. I could never betray my country," her lips pressed into a thin line. "Then you leave me no choice." She turned to the guards. "Take him to the holding cell. Ensure he's treated well, for now." As he was dragged away, Adewale's mind swirled with questions and pain. How had he missed the signs? How had the woman he loved become his greatest enemy? And most importantly, what would he do now? The days in the Biafran camp were grueling. Adewale and his men were confined to a crude holding cell made of wooden planks and barbed wire, its stench a mix of sweat, damp earth, and decay. They were fed just enough to keep them alive: hard bread, murky water, and the occasional bowl of watery soup. Adewale sat in the corner of the cell, his back against the rough wood, his mind racing. His men looked to him for hope, but their spirits were waning. "Captain," Sergeant Danjuma whispered, leaning closer, "if we stay here any longer, well, rot. We need a plan." Adewale nodded, his jaw set. "Well, get out. We just need to be patient and wait for the right moment." Their treatment was deliberately harsh. Guards hurled insults and threats, occasionally dragging men out for interrogations that left them bruised and battered. Adewale bore the brunt of it, but he never broke. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the camp in shadows, a young Biafran soldier approached the cell. His face was thin, his eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and pity. "You're Captain Adewale, aren't you?" the soldier asked in a low voice. Adewale raised his head, his gaze sharp. "Who's asking?" "I heard stories about you," the soldier said, glancing over his shoulder nervously. "You're the one who led the rescue mission in Ogoja, right?" Adewale's silence was answer enough. The soldier knelt closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't agree with all this. My family, they're still in Nigerian territory. If I help you escape, will you promise to protect them?" A flicker of hope ignited in Adewale's chest. "What's your name, soldier?" "Emeka," he replied, his voice trembling. "Emeka," Adewale said, his tone steady. "If you help us, I'll do everything in my power to ensure your family is safe." Emeka hesitated for a moment before nodding. "There is a shift change at midnight. I'll distract the guards and leave the south gate unlocked. You'll have 10 minutes, no more." The hours crawled by as Adewale relayed the plan to his men in hushed tones. They prepared themselves mentally, knowing failure meant certain death. As the clock struck midnight, they heard a faint commotion near the guard tower. True to his word, Emeka had created a diversion. "Move quickly and quietly," Adewale whispered, leading his men out of the cell. The camp was eerily quiet, save for the distant voices of arguing guards. They crept through the shadows, avoiding the beams of light from patrolling flashlights. When they reached the south gate, Adewale pushed it gently. It swung open with a soft creak. He signaled for his men to move, each one slipping through the opening like ghosts. But just as the last man passed through, a shout rang out. "Escapees! Sound the alarm!" The camp erupted in chaos as soldiers scrambled, their boots pounding against the ground. "Run!" Adewale barked, taking the lead. Bullets whizzed past them, some striking trees thudding into the dirt. The men sprinted through the dense forest, their breaths labored but determined. After what felt like hours, they finally stopped to catch their breath. The forest was silent, save for the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a lone wolf. "Is everyone here?" Adewale asked, his voice low but urgent. One by one, his men responded, and relief washed over him when he realized they hadn't lost anyone. "What now, sir?" Danjuma asked, his face streaked with sweat and dirt. "We keep moving," Adewale said firmly. "We find our way back to Nigerian territory and report everything we've learned." As they resumed their trek, Adewale's mind drifted to Lola. Despite her betrayal, he couldn't shake the image of her face, the woman he once loved, now an enigma. "This isn't over," he muttered to himself, his resolve hardening. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't rest until he had answers, and justice for his men. The Nigerian army regrouped with precision, determination etched into the faces of every soldier. After Adewale and his men escaped and relayed their intel, the military wasted no time. The location of the Biafran camp, their strength, and the presence of key figures like Lola were all pieces of a puzzle that Adewale was determined to complete. The briefing room buzzed with tension as Adewale stood before the map pinned to the wall, pointing to key positions. "We attack at dawn," he said, his voice steady. "The camp's defenses are weak in the east. They'll expect us from the south, where their main road lies. That's where we'll send a decoy team. The real strike will come from the east and north." A general nodded approvingly. "Captain Adewale, you've proven your strategic brilliance once again. Lead this mission and make sure no stone is left unturned." "Yes, sir." The sun was just beginning to rise when the Nigerian soldiers moved into position. The forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and chirping birds, masking their approach. Adewale crouched low, his rifle steady, his heart pounding. "Remember," he whispered to his men, "we go in fast and hit hard. No unnecessary casualties. Focus on capturing their key leaders." With a sharp nod, the operation began. The ambush was swift and ruthless. Nigerian soldiers stormed the camp from all sides, their precision leaving the Biafran forces scrambling. Gunfire erupted, echoing through the trees as tents were set ablaze and makeshift barricades crumbled. Adewale moved through the chaos with practiced ease, his eyes scanning for familiar faces. He ducked behind a crate, motioning for his team to advance. "Push forward, secure the prisoners." The battle didn't last long. The Biafrans, caught off guard, quickly surrendered. Soldiers were rounded up, their weapons confiscated as Nigerian forces secured the camp. And then Adewale saw her. Lola stood near the center of the camp, her red beret slightly askew, her face a mix of defiance and defeat. Two soldiers held her arms as she stared at Adewale with an unreadable expression. "Lola," he said, stepping closer, his voice laced with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "Adewale," she replied, her tone calm despite the chaos around them. "How could you?" he asked, his voice trembling. "You betrayed me, your country, everything we stood for." She tilted her chin up. "I fought for what I believed in. Can you say the same?" Adewale clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "Belief doesn't justify betrayal," she smirked faintly. "And war doesn't justify blind loyalty." For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Finally, Adewale turned to the soldiers holding her. "Take her away," he said curtly. As they led her past him, she paused and whispered, "You'll remember me, Adewale, long after this war is over." He didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The camp was secured, and the prisoners were transported back to the Nigerian base. Adewale sat alone in his tent that evening, staring at the small brown book that had been recovered during the raid. It was a bittersweet victory. The mission had been a success, but the scars of betrayal ran deep. Weeks later, as the war raged on, Adewale continued to lead his men with unwavering determination. Yet, in the quiet moments, he couldn't help but think of Lola, the woman who had been his greatest love and his greatest betrayal. War had a way of changing everything. And though the chapter with Lola had ended, Adewale knew his story was far from over.